Being a React developer means that we're going to shift our mindset from writing UI component in traditional HTML and JavaScript into the modern way. First thing first, we need to start viewing a web page as a composition of several components. For example, let's take a look at Google's homepage. It seems like a normal homepage that we all got used to it, but there's actually a lot of things going on behind the scene here. Now, if we break down this website in terms of components, we can say that there's a navbar component that is made out of a few link component and a button component and also the avatar component. And upon clicking on the app button here, we have another sub-component displayed in a DOM that displays all the app that Google provides. Each of these apps could be another component that we load within this app button dropdown. And now zooming out in the middle of the page, we could have another component that displays the search bar. And inside this component, we have the logo component and also the search bar component, followed by two button components down here. And in the footer, we have two sections. One is the country, and the second row is some other miscellaneous link components. So once we can visualize the whole web page as a composition of UI components, the next step is to think about and plan for your next project. Wireframing is extremely important because it helps us to not only visualize the UI and UX of the final product, but also help us to plan for the data flow that happens among the components. Let me give you an example. Let's say I want to build an admin dashboard to manage the users in our app. We'll have a page that contains a search bar and also a table underneath it to display the user data. So in here, we have three major components: the page, the search bar, and also the user table. Now think about this. Which component should we store all the user data? In other words, which component here should be the one that calls the user data API to fetch all the user data for us to show in the user table? Now you might be thinking, we should put it inside the search bar, right? Because the search bar is the main component that performs the searches. Well, the answer is no. Why? Because how are we supposed to pass the data into the table? Remember, the search bar and the table are siblings. If we put the data inside the search bar component, that means we gotta pass the data to the parent, which is component A, and get A to pass to C. While I'm not saying that this is impossible, but it will involve a lot more work, which requires state management, and that's a more complex topic to be discussed later on in the series. And if your answer is to put in the user state data into the table directly, then we would have another problem. How are we supposed to get the search term from the search bar component? The same issue arises. That means we've got only one choice left, which is to put the user state data in component A. So component A will be responsible to fetch the user API and to store the user state. So one way of connecting all these components together is that we will attach a search function to the search bar, so whenever the user types something inside the search bar, we'll trigger this function, and this function will call the user API. And upon calling the user API, we'll update the local state inside component A, which then will feed this data into the user table. In industrial term, component that doesn't have any business logic inside it, like the search bar and the user table, are known as dumb component. A dumb component's behavior usually relies on a prop passed to it. For example, the user table that we have here will simply rely on the user data that we pass to it and render the data in a table. Typically speaking, a dumb component will only have props passed to it, and it usually does not contain any state. Other examples of a dumb component are your typical building block in your app. For example, a button component, a card component, a link component, heading, icon, input, form, and etc. These components should contain zero business logic and are highly reusable across our app. On the other hand, we also got something called a smart component. A smart component, or sometimes known as containers, are components that contains business logic, and they are made out of dumb component. They usually contain states, and component A here is a typical example of a smart component because it runs business logic, in other words, fetching the user API, and contains a state. Anyway, let's go back to wireframing. We could use software like Figma, Miro, or even pen or paper to build our wireframe. So once you have got your wireframe, list down all the components that you need in your app. And think about reusability. Generally speaking, if part of the UI has multiple use cases across our app, it's a good idea to extract it out into a separate component. So in short, we should break our app into the smallest possible building blocks. Now here's a question. If we are going to build all the generic components from scratch, it's going to take a massive amount of time. We will need to build our own custom button, form, input element, so on and so forth from scratch. And that is not ideal at all, especially when we have limited time and budget. So how can we make this better? The answer is, we could leverage a UI library where someone has already done the hard work for us. For example, in React, Material UI is an extremely popular component UI library that is based on material design. As you can see here in their documentation, they have provided us a whole range of beautifully designed front-end UI components that we can use in our project out of the box. They've got a very good documentation as well and provided us snippets where we can copy and paste them directly into our code. There are other UI component libraries out there as well. I have attached a link in the description. Feel free to check it out if you want. Anyway, that being said, using a framework or UI library is a good choice if you don't want to reinvent the wheel. The people who created these libraries typically use the best practices in the industry and provided us a tons of features that would take us forever to write. Alright, key takeaways for this lesson. When viewing a web page, think in terms of components. Plan and build a wireframe before you start coding. It can really help us to visualize the data flow. Dumb components are components that usually don't contain state and rely entirely on the props. They don't run business logic. Smart components, also known as containers, usually contain states and business logic. Leveraging a third-party UI library is a good idea to speed up your development process. That's it for now, and I'll see you again in the next video. If you enjoyed the content of this video, don't forget to hit the like, subscribe and the bell icon for more content to come. It will really help me out. Thanks for your support.